Today, we're delighted to be able to introduce Andrew Davis. Feels like part of the family. He's been with us before, and he's the program director of the Center for Process Studies, which was founded by John Cobb and David Griffin back in 1973, I think it was. Andrew Davis is a philosopher, theologian, a scholar of world religions. He has a BA in Philosophy and Theology, an MA in Interreligious Studies, and from the Claremont School of Theology, a Ph.D. in Religion and Process Philosophy. He calls himself a poet, an aphorist, an author or editor of 4 books, including How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, which is an anthology of spiritual memoirs. Another book, Propositions in the Making, Experiments in a Whiteheadian Laboratory. Another book, Depths As Yet Unspoken, which are excursions in mysticism, multiplicity, and divinity. And another one, Mind, Value, and Cosmos, which is on the relational nature of ultimacy. And this last book has been actually nominated for the International Society of Science and Religion 2022 Book Prize. So, Andrew, we're delighted that you have decided to share with us something you shared previously with Tom Ord's conference on open and relational theology. And we look forward to hearing more about ideas in process, 10 Whiteheadian transitions. But first, we want John Cobb to welcome you to his living room. John?
Well, I'm happy to welcome you. We haven't ever gotten very well acquainted, and all the more since I'm so aware and appreciative of the leadership you're giving in the whole process movement. I'm delighted to have this chance to listen again to what you have to say. So thanks for coming. I hope we'll see more of you.
I hope so as well, John. Thank you very much. And Ron, thank you as well. And good morning, everybody. Good evening, I know, to some of you. It's wonderful to see a diverse group from all over the globe. I think this captures certainly something of what the Cobb Institute wants to exemplify in their relationships. And certainly as those of us who are interested in process thought, the ways in which we are all deeply interconnected. So I appreciate the invite to be back here again. I love this community. I love Claremont, having spent a number of years there. So it always feels like coming home, although I'm sitting in my own home, which is not there in Claremont. Well, as was mentioned, this is a presentation that I had given at ORTCon 2022, that is the Open and Relational Theology Conference that is put on by Tom Ord, who's in the audience here. Good morning, Tom. And will also be taking place again next year. So I hope you'll stay tuned on the opportunity to attend that event. It's a wonderful event. So this presentation will be a re-presentation of the lecture that was given there. And I should also say, before I begin, when I first came to Jay and to Ron with this idea, Jay had wanted to see the PowerPoint, I think in part to see how it resonated with the mission and vision statement of the Cobb Institute, which actually includes 14 transitions. So Richard, perhaps you can post that link for viewers, and you can bring those up and see the ways in which there is some important difference, but also some resonance between what I'm calling 10 Whiteheadian transitions and what the vision of the Institute there has called 14 transformations. So ideas in process. Okay, we're going to talk about some fundamental transitions ideologically when it comes to thinking about our understanding of Whitehead's philosophy, and not just that, but also our living out of Whitehead's philosophy. To be process thinkers is to be in transition, to feel that, if you want, in our bones. And I include 3 images here of Whitehead that I think are wonderful. We have him as a cute little baby, as a young man, and then as an older man. We see this element of transition in his growth. To begin, also on a comedic note, you see that his hairline, I think, was in transition as well. You see him with no hair as a child, with some hair as a young man, and with no hair again, that's certainly a transition that I think many of us, and I include myself, can appreciate. So let's jump right in. What do I mean when I speak about transitions? Well, I'm speaking about both existential and theological transitions. So these transitions that I want to bring to you this morning are fundamentally going to concern your existence and your experience, and in particular, how you're going to understand these in relation to the wider world. So I want to suggest that each of them are going to harbor some important implications for how you live, for how you move, or how you have your being in the world, to quote that passage from Acts. In addition to being existential, I think they're deeply theological, okay, to the extent that I think they're going to change the way you picture God and God's relationship to God's interaction with the world. Okay, I want to suggest equally that they're going to harbor important theological implications for how you live and move and have your being in God, and how God lives and moves in you. So I want to bring out not just some of the philosophical, some of the intellectual content of these transitions, but I hope there's also going to be some practical, pragmatic ways in which this helps us live differently, because I think that is an element of Whiteheadian thought that cannot be lost, not just the theoretical, but we need the living, we need the practical. And I hope at the end we can engage in some discussion. I'd be really interested to hear some of your thoughts about what you think about these transitions, which are most important, maybe perhaps how they resonate with some of the transformations of the vision of the Cobb Institute. So I think that will be a fruitful time for us. All right, let us jump in then to what we'll say is just transition one. And I should say that these are all deeply entangled. So there is no particular chronological order, I think, that must be followed when it comes to these transitions. So the first transition that I want to highlight for you is what I'm calling the transition from exception to exemplification. Now, for Whitehead, he looks to modern philosophy and to science, and he points out essentially what have been unconscious sins of bifurcation and abstraction. In other words, when modern science and philosophy approached nature, they had this tendency to want to study it objectively. And in doing so, they abstracted or made independent human existence and experience. And one way of putting this is that human existence or experience became an exception to, rather than an exemplification of, everything that is going on in nature. And when you abstract the human existent element, the human experiential element, it's no surprise really that nature becomes, as Whitehead says, purely material, non-experiential. It becomes valueless, purposeless, and ultimately blind. And process thinkers are not just overemphasizing this point. Even in today's discourse, some of the most popular scientists are presupposing this notion that human beings are an exception to, rather than an expression of, the deepest character of reality. I think one way to express this is to look at a great sort of tweet battle between the famous astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson and the late comedian Norm Macdonald. So listen to the assumptions, if you want, of Tyson's tweet. He says, "The universe is blind to our sorrows and indifferent by our pains. Have a nice day." Comforting statement. To which Macdonald fires back, "Neil, there is a logic flaw in your little aphorism that seems quite telling. Since you and I are part of the universe, then we would also be indifferent and uncaring. Perhaps you forgot, Neil, that we are not superior to the universe, but merely a fraction of it. Nice day indeed." And so the reason I've juxtaposed these two statements is because I think they illustrate nicely human beings as an exception on one hand, because Tyson can only utter these statements by removing himself from the equation, and human exemplification on the other, which I think is captured by Macdonald's response in a very beautiful way. So for Whitehead's scheme, for this transition, you are an exemplification and not an exception. And in part, what this means is that your experience is a fundamental clue as to the nature of reality at various scales and levels. And I think we, of course, must say this now because we know definitively that we've not fallen into the world from somewhere else so that we could be completely different from it. I think that's such an important conviction for process thinking. Rather, to use an organic metaphor, we've grown out of the world as a plant grows out of soil. In a deep sense, as I like to say, we are geography in both body and mind, and we are an example of the world in intimate experiential form. And to continue this sort of organic metaphor, think of how a flower is intrinsically connected to the nature of the soil out of which it grows. Okay, there's a deep sense in which Whiteheadian thought sees us as intrinsically connected to the depths of reality out of which we have grown. Okay, and that's a very significant point, I think, that cannot be missed when first beginning to grapple with or to approach Whitehead's thinking. And I don't know about you, but I think it's rather significant in a very deep way. For example, you are very small in comparison to this universe. We know that with the recent web space photos, which have been amazing. And nevertheless, your experience is actually quite big for Whitehead because it expresses the same ultimate depths that reign throughout nature in various intensities. Okay, we might put this differently and say that your experience, while immanent to yourself, also transcends you because it's connected to the entire cosmos as a whole. And I think Whitehead, moreover, was fully cognizant of the fact that when we begin to approach human experience in this way, a wonderful sense of belonging emerges. In one of my favorite statements, he says, "In being ourselves, we are more than ourselves, to know that our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds the utmost depths of reality." Okay, Whitehead always being deeply poetic. So for Whitehead's universe, to exist in it, to experience in it in the way that you do, means that you belong here. Right? The universe welcomes your being, and if it didn't, you wouldn't be. I think it's an important existential realization when it comes to Whitehead's thought. Now, how does this apply to God? We see in part how it applies to us existentially, but what about God? For Whitehead, it's not only the case that you are an exemplification rather than an exception to these utmost depths of reality, but God too is an exemplification, albeit preeminently. And some of you will know Whitehead's famous statement that God is not to be treated as an exception to the utmost depths of reality invoked to save their collapse. He is their chief exemplification. Now, when it comes to making philosophical and theological commitments, there's largely two options one can take when thinking about how God might relate to these ultimate depths of reality, these metaphysical depths. So one would be that God is an exception, right? In the sense that God will supernaturally establish these ultimate principles, and in doing so stand outside of them, outside of the world, and outside of you. And the other would be that God chiefly exemplifies or chiefly embodies these ultimate principles within the divine life. And as such, God is naturally and congruently related to the world from the inside. Now, the trajectories of each of these options are vast. We don't have time to go into those, but suffice to say that for Whitehead, for process thinkers, we found it very important to follow the claim that God too expresses within God's life the ultimate depths of reality. As Pittenger says here, for sound explanation, it is essential that we look for genuine congruity between God and his world, rather than that we attempt to find the ways in which God can be removed from all contact with and reflection in that world, and hence treated as nothing other than the great exception. Okay, so transition one from exception to exemplification. Okay, the second transition is the transition from being to becoming. Now, one of the most fundamental dimensions of data that human experience gives us is that reality is most fundamentally conceived as a process of becoming. In fact, as my friend Robert Kuhn from Closer to Truth likes to say, process philosophy holds that becoming is bedrock and being is byproduct. In fact, he told me to put that onto a shirt as a process shirt. I have yet to do that. Perhaps that's something we can do. So what's being said, in other words, is that becoming is more fundamental than being, or as I like to put it, a reality is verb-like before it is noun-like, okay? And Whitehead brings this out beautifully. He says, reality is not static. It is a process of becoming. Indeed, the fact is too obvious to escape notice, but unfortunately, things which are too obvious often escape receiving their due emphasis. And I think this is what happened when we look at the sort of rivals the development of the metaphysical tradition. We see those philosophies of permanence, and we see these philosophies of flux. And on the whole, the tradition took the direction of affirming philosophies of permanence, or a noun-like philosophies and the various dimensions associated with it, discrete individuality, separateness, independence, various dimensions that are associated with viewing the world as a noun-like world. And of course, when we look at these two lists, we realize we have in our experience elements of permanence, elements of flux. We have to in some way make sense of both of these dimensions. But the question for the metaphysical tradition in a deep way is which of these is primary? Which of these takes precedence over the other? Which is derivative from the other? And in part, to be a process thinker in the tradition of Whitehead, but not just Whitehead, is to see these elements on the right side of the list as being more fundamental, right? The process and becoming are more fundamental, and that permanence and being, if you want, are derivative kind notions. So as Rescher says, he says, becoming and change, the origination, the flourishing and the passing of the old, and the innovative emergence of ever new existence, these are what constitute the central themes of process metaphysics. Now, what does this all mean for you? Well, it means that you're not so much a being that becomes, but rather what I like to say is simply a becoming into being, that it's happening moment by moment. Some of you will know that Whitehead uses the language of concrescence for this. And I would suggest that in part what this means is that who or what you are, or even what you could be in life, is open rather than closed. It's not defined by noun-like fixity. Rather, there's a deep sense in which you really are a verb-like pattern that is shifting, shaping, adventuring forward in Whitehead's universe. And I would also emphasize it's not just significant for you individually, but also for society collectively. For example, what would happen if we could transition from categories of static being to those of becoming? Right? We might find that the world is not stuck in repetitions of sameness, destructive patterns, nor in these noun-like sort of fixations. Rather, to hark back to Heraclitus, the world is never the same twice, just like human experience. And it's like a flowing river that's verbing itself beyond the fixations of the past. This is very significant for us individually and collectively. Now, what about theologically? What does this mean for God? Well, certainly throughout the Western intellectual tradition, the category of being has been elevated, and the category of becoming has been pushed down, as it were, when it comes to thinking about God. So in part, God has been seen as a being alongside other beings, but when you look to the philosophical dimensions of the tradition, God was seen as the ground of all being, or being itself. What Aquinas said was ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent ground of being itself. And as such, God was seen to be exempt from all the attributes of particular beings, particular finite beings. So for example, being itself was perfect, and as such, it was eternal and unchanging, while finite beings, like you and I, are imperfect because we are temporal and we are subject to change. So God and the world, in other words, were at odds. There's a certain antithesis between them in a deep and significant sense. And yet Whitehead rejects this picture. He offers a way of reuniting being and becoming, really in a vision of God that's going to include both. So becoming is not to be seen as contradictory to God, but rather complementary. As Charles Hartshorne has argued at length, becoming in God is a part of divine excellence or perfection. That's quite a deviation from the tradition. And consider Hans Jonas in this regard. He says, such an idea of divine becoming is surely at variance with the Greek, Platonic, Aristotelian tradition of philosophical theology, that since its incorporation into the Jewish and Christian tradition has somehow usurped for itself an authority to which it is not at all entitled. And so being has had this dominant place, and in many ways continues to have this place today. Ian McGilchrist, who was mentioned as we were beginning, says our culture emphasizes being to the exclusion of becoming. However, there is an asymmetry. They are not equal. In the philosophy of Whitehead, the divine is in becoming, and becoming is even more fundamental than being. I should say, as an aside, I fully agree with the comments that were made. Ian McGilchrist is, I would say, the most significant ally to process thinking, process philosophy to date. I would encourage everybody to look at his work. I hope he would actually join the Institute. We should be pushing for that, I hope. Okay, transition 3 is from mechanism to organism. Now, some of you will know that Whitehead called his philosophy not process philosophy. That's a term that goes back to, I think, Bernard Loomer, but rather the philosophy of organism. And in part, this designation seeks to respond to the collapse of this mechanistic, materialistic universe. And in particular, what Whitehead says is its affirmation of a senseless, valueless, purposeless matter as being really the ultimate base, the ultimate substratum of reality. So Cartesian Newtonian physics was based on this view, as Whitehead says, on the static individuality of each bit of matter. And yet, bit by bit, Whitehead says, this concept was given way or dissolved by the advance of modern physics. And what it dissolved into for Whitehead was something far more fluid, something far more organic and deeply interrelated in nature. So Whitehead sees this happening and he steps back and says the field is now open for the introduction of some new doctrine of organism, which may take the place of the materialism with which since the 17th century science has saddled philosophy, right? Putting a saddle on a horse, as it were. It's a good image. As Hosinski rightly states here, Whitehead was convinced that actualities and the universe as a whole are more like organisms than like machines. And he found that modern physics itself suggested this view. And not just modern physics. Whitehead, of course, was deeply involved in discussions of psychology, of developmental biology, of sciences of electromagnetism, all of which in their own way were converging on this much more organic and interrelated perspective. So in part, Whitehead and others helped inaugurate what we might say is really a battle of metaphors. Okay, is nature deeply mechanistic, right, a mechanical universe, or is it organic, right? And of course, we could spend time sort of comparing and contrasting these different elements, but is the universe clock-like, watch-like, or machine-like, or is it like a growing plant, a tree, and an animal? And of course, I think to answer this question, we can do nothing else than to look to our own experience. Now, remember to say, in light of our first transition, if we are an exemplification of the world, that means that our relationship to the world is literally the world's relationship to itself. And that's extremely significant. If you think about your experience, you are organic, aren't you? You are a growing organism. You exhibit relational interdependence. You have internal and not just external relations. You are creative. Your experience involves evoking and feeling. And I think if you pay attention to your experience, you'll begin to see that, right, in a deep way. Now, if this is the case, this is true about us in the universe we live in, I think that there's something we all need to stop doing. We need to stop living, I would suggest, as though the world, human beings, and God are mechanical. Okay, and we do this, don't we? We do it relationally, economically, politically, theologically, even though we affirm an organic universe, right? It's not enough, I would suggest, to buy organic or to eat organic. Okay, these are important, but they're a cliche. Right? On Whitehead's universe, we have to be organic in our very mode of relating to the world and its inhabitants. And so I think there's a very beautiful organic spirituality, is what I call it, at the heart of living out Whitehead's philosophy of organism. And of course, this sort of organic spirituality doesn't just float anywhere. It's actually connected to organic understanding of God. So Whitehead affirms a deeply organic God, and in this way, to hark back to the band, he's involved in a theological rage against the machine. So the God of the mechanical universe had to supernaturally intervene into it, okay, like a designer of a machine, right, adjusting the misfirings from the outside and often with absolute control. I think of even Newton saying that God from time to time had to intervene to adjust the movements of the heavenly bodies. And yet an organic God, on Whitehead's scheme, will express in its very nature those very, what I'm calling ecological relations, that's wedded to the universe as a participant. And the language I like to use for that is symbiosis, right? The God and the universe for Whitehead are symbiotically and not mechanically related. And in part, what that means is that they each influence and are mutually related to the other. So metaphors matter in this way. Okay? The way we view the world is connected to the way we view God, and the way we view God is also mutually connected to the way we view the world. And of course, our dear friend, Dr. Cobb, said a number of years ago, if the world is viewed as a complex machine, then the correlative doctrine of God is likely to be that of a creator who stands outside of his creation. But if the world is viewed in organic terms, the principle of life, order, and growth must be immanent to the organisms. So it's a wonderful, wonderful statement expressing this, this transition. Okay, our fourth transition is the transition from independence to mutual immanence. Now, when Whitehead looks at the development of modern thought, he laments in a significant way that categories of independence, isolation, and non-relation were in a way elevated to philosophical and scientific orthodoxy. Okay, and these categories, I think, in part helped reinforce this mechanical and materialistic vision, which saw independent bits of matter as fundamental to the nature of things. Now, Whitehead completely rejects this picture, and in doing so, he calls it the chief misconception of all of philosophy. The misconception which has haunted philosophic literature is the notion of independent existence. There's no such mode of existence. Rather, every entity is only to be understood in terms of the way in which it is interwoven with the rest of the universe. And notice that in addition to pointing to the misconception of independent existence, Whitehead is also pointing to its remedy, namely in this relationship of interwovenness. And we'll see in a moment how Whitehead names that relationship. So the philosophical tradition on Whitehead's scheme suffered from a particular ailment. And it's an ailment that I call nothing but syndrome. You'll recognize René Descartes here, the founder of modern philosophy. In particular, Descartes suffered from this nothing but syndrome. And the reason I call it that is because Descartes, following Aristotle, dimensions certainly of the Greek tradition, insists that the world is made of substances, right? That which substands or stands under all else. And he offers a definition of substance as an existent thing, which requires, and here it is, nothing but itself in order to exist. In other words, he's conceiving the fundamental entities of the world as ultimately being isolated, independent, unrelated. Okay? And in this way, they require nothing but themselves in order to exist. So Whitehead is strongly combative against this notion. He says it's the final conclusion of the absoluteness of independence to which I am objecting. And of course, not just Whitehead, but those who are a part of the process tradition, those who are writing after Whitehead, or those who reject a reductive picture of reality are also against this nothing but syndrome. And here I give another example from Ian McGilchrist. He says at the core of the contemporary world is the view that nature is nothing but a bundle of senseless particles, pointlessly, helplessly colliding in a predictable fashion, whose existence is purely material and whose only value is utility. I cannot remember a time when I thought this sounded at all convincing, and a lifetime's thinking and learning has done nothing to ally my skepticism. Not only is it mistaken, I believe, but actively damaging, physically to the natural world, and psychologically, morally, and spiritually to ourselves as part of that world. It endangers everything that we should value. It's a wonderful statement, I think, that could have been uttered by Whitehead. And I'd like to give another example of this kind of rejection of this nothing but syndrome that comes from Roger Scruton. There's a widespread habit of declaring realities to be nothing but the things in which we perceive them. The human person is nothing but the human animal. Law is nothing but the relations of social power. Sexual love, nothing but the urge to procreation. Altruism, nothing but the dominant genetic strategy. The Mona Lisa, nothing but a spread of pigments on canvas. The Ninth Symphony, nothing but a sequence of pitch sounds of varying timbre, and so on. He says getting rid of this habit is, to my mind, the true goal of philosophy. I think that's a statement that could have been equally uttered by Whitehead, and Scruton, in fact, would go on to say that if you're willing to get rid of nothing but syndrome with respect to the small things, you should also be willing to get rid of it with respect to the large things. And in that case, you could no longer say that the universe is nothing but the laws of nature. And then he says, if you've made that step, you're one step away from affirming the reality of God. So sort of wonderful progression of thought. So what about God? Well, unfortunately, when Whitehead looks at the theological tradition, he also sees that it suffered from nothing but syndrome. Okay, God became the ultimate substance by being ultimately independent, isolated, and non-related to the world. Now, to combat this, Whitehead instead points to this relationship of interwovenness. And the terms he uses, he names this with, is mutual immanence. Okay, mutual immanence is a relationship not only applicable to the entities in the world, but also to God's relationship to the world. It is a model of God, if you want. He says mutual immanence in this way is a fundamental philosophic doctrine, and while it was not applied to the concept of God, it should have been. So Whitehead applies it. Okay, he says there is no entity, not even God, which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. And in his famous statement of mutual immanence, it is as true to say that the world is immanent in God as that God is immanent in the world. Transition 5. Notice the feather. What image does it evoke for you? Okay, we're going to move from force to persuasion. Whitehead, I think, was one of the most voracious critics in a real way of coercive power in the philosophical and theological tradition. When I use that language, I'm meaning force, coercion. It's the kind of push and pull power which is going to compel obedience based on fear. Okay, I think we're all acquainted with that notion. And yet Whitehead insists that the recourse to force is a disclosure of the failure of civilization. Okay, that is a very strong statement. And not just that, it's also a failure of that kind of barbaric style theology, which might imagine God to be the ultimate expression of coercive power in the universe. In fact, when Whitehead looks at Christian faith, he speaks of the tragic history of Christianity, which concerns essentially its failure to embody and live up to these ideals of Christ, and instead opt for the barbarism of power. And to give one statement, he says the theological failure consisted in the fact that barbaric elements had not been discarded, but remained as essential elements in the various formulations of Christian theology, orthodox and heretical alike. The issue of these failures is the tragic history of Christianity. But Whitehead, of course, is not content to just leave a situation with a tragic history, even though tragedy is real. In part, he is seeking to redeem the theological tradition. I don't think it's false to say that. And to do so, he looks back in history. He looks to Plato in particular and insists that Plato has made the greatest intellectual discovery in the history of religion. And take a moment to appreciate that. That is quite a statement to make when you think of the sweeping history of religion, the greatest intellectual discovery. And this discovery, as some of you will know, was Plato's conviction that the divine element is to be conceived as a persuasive agency and not as a coercive agency. As he states, more than 2,000 years ago, the wisest of men proclaimed the divine persuasion is the foundation of the order of the world, but that it can only produce such a measure of harmony as amid brute forces it was possible to accomplish. Now, if Whitehead looks to Plato as substantiating this view of persuasion theoretically, he then looks to Christ next as the greatest exemplification of this theoretical discovery. So the essence of Christianity, Whitehead tells us, is the appeal to the life of Christ as a revelation of the nature of God and of his agency in the world. The life of Christ is not an exhibition of overruling power. His power lies in its absence of force. And then he asks, can there be any doubt that the power of Christianity lies in its revelation in act of that which Plato divined in theory? It's a wonderful question. So what is he getting at, in part at least? Well, he's saying that in the person of Christ, we see the realized or the active revelation of this divine element that Plato only intellectually or theoretically discerned, namely persuasive love. And yet again, he laments that this persuasion as revealed in Christ became the opposite, essentially, of what God became, namely coercive force. And when it comes to us at a very practical level, it's easy to ask, which are we going to imitate? It's rather difficult in today's world to live out the trajectories of each of these. Do we want to, with Plato, only say that we theoretically commit to persuasive love? Or do we want to follow Christ and live that out and embody it in our lives? Or the third option, will we follow the image of the centurion and contribute to the coercive force that is already part of the world? Okay, it's an existential and difficult question, certainly. Okay, transition 6 then is from dogmatism to dynamism. Now, in addition to being a critic of power, Whitehead, I think, is also one of the most wonderful critics of dogmatism across science, philosophy, and religion. And dogmatism, by using that language, all I'm speaking about is essentially this unchecked habit of exaggerating, say, the finality of our current understandings, okay, and the various concepts, the foundations or ideas that are associated with them. And of course, we could give a number of examples in our time, okay, the finality of one philosophical system, okay, Whiteheadian or otherwise, the finality of a political paradigm, or any one scientific creed or dogma, the finality of any one religious orthodoxy, for example. So Whitehead sees our tendency toward dogmatism, and he stands back and says nothing is more curious than the self-satisfied dogmatism with which mankind, at each period of its history, cherishes the delusion of the finality of its existing modes of thought. Skeptics and believers are all alike. Okay, a wonderful, wonderful statement. So at the heart of Whitehead's system is the injunction to be dynamic and not dogmatic. And what this might mean with respect to our ideas is that our ideas are open rather than closed, right? In principle, they're open to being revised or expanded, okay, altered, or even, if it should call for it, rejected, okay? And I would suggest that practicing dynamism rather than dogmatism would help transform our disciplines, whether philosophy, science, religion, politics, all of which we know love to hold tight to their dogmas, okay? And one example Whitehead gives in Religion and Theology here is that religions commit suicide when they find their inspirations in their dogmas. Right? Whitehead has a wonderful way of cutting to the point. But not just religions, right? How is it that other disciplines commit suicide when they find their inspirations in their dogmas? Right? It's not so much that they're murdered from the outside, but that our institutions, our disciplines commit suicide from within. And that is, I think, significant discussion that we could have perhaps later on. So he points rather to the dynamism of religious experience, which for Whitehead is always going to escape the position of dogmas. There's something in experience that is unable to just simply be captured in a creed, a statement, or any sort of verbal rendering. Language in this way is very, very limited. And of course, for him, any dynamism we have in theology and religion must ultimately be based or substantiated in a vision of divine dynamism, God's relationship to the world. And the pair of Cobb and Griffin, well, listen to how they express this. Okay, far from sanctioning the status quo, recognition of the essential dynamism of Whitehead's God implies a continual creative transformation of that which is received from the past in light of the divinely received call forward to actualize novel possibilities. In Whitehead's words, the purest conservative is fighting against the essence of the universe. So there's a deep sense in which Whitehead's God is mischievous in this way. In fact, Whitehead even compares this element of God to Eti, okay, the goddess of mischief in Greek mythology. So this vision of divine dynamism is a vision of God not seeking the preservation, say, of any one established order, but rather novelty and intensity in reaching for something still up ahead. And this activity, I think, is mischievous in that it seeks to interrupt, to perturb our stasis and what we might say is our premature contentments, okay? Here's one example. The immensity of the world negates the belief that any state of order can be so established that beyond it there can be no progress. This belief in a final order, popular in religious and philosophic thought, presents a fallacious conception of the universe. Okay, in a universe that is radically driving towards novelty, it is fallacious to say that we've arrived at any one final order. Okay, an existentially significant thought in and of itself. So the universe for Whitehead then seeks novelty because of, and not in spite of, God, the mischievous God. The seventh transition I'd like to bring to you is the transition from passivity to creativity. Now, some of you will know that really more than any other philosopher, Whitehead elevated the notion of creativity to its highest possible place. And in a deep sense, it's right to call creativity the ultimate reality in Whitehead's thought. He calls it the ultimate of ultimates, or just the universal of universals. Okay, and creativity is this restless temporal becoming that is embodied by every actuality in the universe. If you want, it's Creativity is what makes it true that becoming is more fundamental than being. That might be one way to understand it. Creativity in the dictionary sense, Whitehead says, from the verb creare, is to bring forth, to beget, to produce. That's what the universe is doing in every moment. And no entity, he says, can be divorced from the notion of creativity. What is more, an entity is capable of infusing its own particularity into creativity. That's a very significant statement. So there's a sense in which on Whitehead's scheme, there's something you need to stop saying or stop thinking. And I've often heard this from students. I've often heard this from friends. You need to stop saying, I'm not creative. In a universe where creativity is conceived as this ultimate reality, for Whitehead, you are not only an outcome of creativity, like by virtue of existing, by virtue of being actual, but you're also a personal shaper of creativity. In other words, you're the means through which creativity can become expressed and personalized in particular and finite and beautiful kinds of ways. So our purpose on Whitehead's scheme, in one way, is to cultivate this creativity, right? To channel the creativity of the universe through ourselves, to make our countries, our civilizations, our citizens better by adding value to the world in creative and aesthetic kinds of ways. So, and I hear people saying I'm more passive than creative, but again, to be passive in this kind of universe is to essentially refuse the conditions of being, which are becoming. They are the creative advance of things. So I would encourage all of you on Whitehead's scheme to live out this element, to be creative. They see if you can, with Henri Bergsson, for example, say, I believe I experience creativity at every moment of my life. I think Whitehead could have uttered this exact same statement. Now, what about God and creativity? Because we said that creativity is the ultimate reality for Whitehead. Okay, and that's true. But if that's the case, then what is God? Well, God can be conceived as the ultimate actuality. Okay, God, in other words, is the ultimate actual embodiment of creativity in and for a creative universe. And Whitehead brings this out beautifully, saying God is the aboriginal instance of this creativity and is therefore the aboriginal condition which qualifies its action for the world. It is the function of actuality to characterize creativity, and God is the eternal primordial character. God gives creativity a character. Right, so God and the world then embody creativity for each other. And this image on the right is capturing that in a significant way, right? That God and the universe are in this infinite relationship, and that relationship is one of embodying and expressing creativity for each other. And this is essentially new in the history of philosophy, as Ward brings out. He says, for Whitehead, temporality and creativity are essential features of any actual being whatsoever, including God. For the first time in the history of philosophy, a major theistic philosopher not only stresses the reality of the finite material world unequivocally, but also makes temporality a thing of positive value, a condition of real creativity. Okay, it is an important innovation in thinking about the world philosophically and theologically. All right, transition 8 then, as we move closer to the end, is from decadence to adventure. Now, Whitehead's philosophy really is a philosophy adventure in the deepest possible sense. And I want to give a shout out here to his book, Adventures of Ideas. It's a wonderful book on civilization, where among other things, he insists upon the importance of adventure for the promotion, for the preservation of civilization. Those are important words, I think. He's adamant, moreover, that without adventure, a civilization is in full decay, and that adventure belongs to the very essence of civilization. Consider his comment in this regard, okay? He says, the foundation of all understanding of human life is that no static maintenance of perfection is possible. This axiom is rooted in the nature of things. Advance or decadence are the only choices offered to mankind. So when it comes to you, the choice is between advance or decadence. And the choice is yours in a deep way. We might say that decadence is this personal or societal decay that results from excessive comfort or luxury, right? What we might say is a premature contentment with what's possible for ourselves and what's possible for the world. Okay, we might say it's the decline the cultural societal decline that is a result of settling for less rather than more when it comes to what we positively could be. Again, this applies individually and also collectively. And advance or adventure, by contrast, for Whitehead, has to do with keeping the possibility alive, like the possible as this lure for higher realization. The aim is upward in a positive sense, in a value sense of achievement, of something beyond what the past is simply delivered. So adventure for Whitehead essentially has to do then with essentially what he calls the infinity of possibilities that confront human beings. Now, I've said it before, I think, with the Cobb Institute, but Whitehead was nothing short of haunted by these infinite possibilities and how they apply to us individually, how they apply to us culturally and as civilizations. He says, I wish I could convey the sense I have, and I hope you'll sit with this statement here, of the infinity of possibilities that confront humanity, the limitless variations of choice, the possibility of novel and untried combinations, the happy turns of experiment, the endless horizons opening out. As long as we experiment, as long as we keep this possibility of progressiveness, we and our societies are alive. When we lose them, both we and our societies are dead. No matter how externally active we and they may be, no matter how materially prosperous they and we may appear, and nothing is easier than to lose this, the element of novelty. It is the living principle of thought which keeps all alive. But it's such a significant statement. So adventure and possibility go together, and adventure and possibility are brought together with a dream. This is one way we might understand it. Okay, so the world for Whitehead dreams. He says the world dreams of things to come, and then in due season arouses itself to their realization. This is an adventure of thought regarding things as yet unrealized. But it's not just the world for Whitehead that dreams, but God also dreams. The adventure of the universe, he says, starts with a dream and reaps tragic beauty. Well, whose dream is it that starts off the adventure of the universe? It's not my dream. I would hasten to say it's not your dream. It is, we might conceive it as a divine dream in a significant way. But this dream, this adventurous dream. So Whitehead sort of drops the language of God as his corpus continues, and he brings different terms in to label God. For example, the supreme adventure, or the adventure of the universe as one. And in part, God as adventure is dreaming for Whitehead for the world to move on its decadence into novelty, to achievement, and to refreshment. What we might say is simply the satisfaction that is found in adventure. Okay. Move the chat there. There we are. So God on Whitehead's scheme is found in part in adventure. And if this is the case, we need to attend to the ways in which we are decadent individually and collectively. All right, the ninth transition I'd like to discuss here is related, okay, from pessimism to possibility. It's related, but it's also distinct. So Whitehead's philosophy, in addition to being this philosophy of adventure, really is a philosophy of possibility in the strongest possible sense. And the reason for this is because process is fundamental. And the way he conceives process, or what process involves, is the actualization of possibilities in each moment. Okay, his statement, the notion of possibility is fundamental as soon as the notion of process is admitted. And in part, how he understands possibilities, to not get complicated, are as alternative realizations, okay, in the past, in the future, in the present. And he says possibilities tell tales of what may be and what may have been, okay? There's a beautiful sense that possibilities as maybes and may have beens are not value neutral. They're not vacuous. It's not just a beautiful sense, but also a tragic and tumultuous sense. The fact that possibilities ahead of us or behind us have certain grades of importance and types of importance that are wedded to them. They have a value character. And I don't know about you, but I feel the weight of possibility in terms of triumph, in terms of tragedy. Okay, think of the way in which you're tempted by what you could be, what may be ahead of you. but there's a way, essentially, in which you're tortured as well by the tragedies, what may have been different behind us, but was not. So Whitehead, to give an example, lost his son Eric in World War I. He was an aviator and was shot down. And you intuit the sense of which tragedies associated with what may have been different, okay, but was not. He felt it in his bones, as I think do we, right? The future is big. Every possibility of achievement and of tragedy, hope and fear, joy and disillusion obtain their meaning from the potentialities in the nature of things. So now you all know that we live in deeply pessimistic times. And I think in part, at least, we might understand pessimism to be a natural response to the fact that often tragedies do outweigh triumphs. And in part, in doing this, they work to limit what is possible for us, both individually and collectively. And tragedy, I think, becomes despair or disillusion when possibilities become so limited that our life essentially is devoid of those alternatives that Whitehead is speaking of. For those of you who've read Kierkegaard, he essentially defines despair as lacking possibility. And he calls it a battle of faith. He says we're battling madly, if you will, for possibility, because possibility is the only salvation. When someone faints, we call for water. When someone wants to despair, then the word is get possibility. Possibility is the only salvation. And I love that association of salvation with possibility. There's a soteriological aspect to possibility that I think resonates with Whitehead. There's a way in which we can understand possibilities on Whitehead's scheme as essentially poetic modes of divine salvation. Of course, it's a much more complicated discussion, but in brief, God for Whitehead is the ground of the mystery of the possible and its relevance to the world as it becomes into being at each moment. So God's role in part is to offer novel possibilities to the world so it's able to transcend the pessimism, the disillusion, even the despair associated with its past, okay, or potentially even its present. So God's function in this way is soteriological. Okay, in the actual world, Whitehead says God confronts what is actual in it with what is possible for it. Now, this wonderful image of God confronting the closure of actuality to give it a way into openness in life. Right? That God is the ground of the future in this way. And in his famous statement of soteriology, God does not create the world, he saves it. Or more accurately, God is the poet of the world with tender patience, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, I include this for my Christian background. Those of you who are in the Christian tradition, I was raised thinking God had a definitive plan that would unfold for my life. And yet I think it's much better to understand the statement in the sense that God knows the possibilities God has for us, the possibilities for prospering and not harm, possibilities for hope and for a future. God is the ground of the possible. I think we can utter this verse once again. So turn away from pessimism. That would be my injunction to you all, and turn toward the possible. There's a deep sense in which on Whitehead's scheme, this is a turn toward the divine. It's a turn toward God. Okay, the final transition that I will bring to you is the transition from solitude to divine world loyalty. Now, for those of you who have read Whitehead, solitariness or solitude is an important theme when he's understanding the evolution of religion, the development of religious consciousness. His book, Religion in the Making, really is a short and a brilliant meditation on these themes and in the context of his cosmology and his philosophy. And what he's getting out in saying that solitariness is discernible as constituting the heart of religious importance is this idea that the individual is a part of a tribe, a herd mentality, that the individual begins to separate himself or herself from the tribe, begins to essentially confront the magnitude, the universe alone. This is the solitary aspect. And he calls this the awful ultimate fact, which is the human being consciously alone with itself for its own sake. Religion is what the individual does with his own solitariness. Now, in part, Whitehead is building on William James here, but not just that. When Whitehead surveys the religious tradition, he says the great religious conceptions which haunt our imaginations are scenes of solitariness, Prometheus chained to his rock, Muhammad brooding in the desert, the meditations of the Buddha, the solitary man on the cross. And then he says it belongs to the depth of the religious spirit to have felt forsaken, even by God. Okay, yet another powerful statement. Now, the solitary spirit, this individual solitariness, is not idle. It probes, it poses questions of ultimate concern. For example, in its solitariness, the spirit asks, what in the way of value is the attainment of life? Okay, it's a huge question. And it can find no such value till it has merged its individual claim with that of the objective universe. Whitehead now defines religion as world loyalty. So we see this wonderful movement of inward to outward, right? What begins within in the solitary confrontation with the universe ushers outward in loyalty to the world as this arena where there is value creation possible and where there's value connection. Okay, and I kind of like to see that as a move from the self to more than the self. So in your solitariness on Whitehead's scheme, don't forget about the world. Again, another existential injunction we might take from all this. Now, Whitehead, in addition to understanding the solitary spirit as evolving toward the world in religious loyalty, it also evolves towards God, or we might say through images of God in divine world loyalty. So he says there is a transition from God the void to God the enemy, and from God the enemy to God the companion. So God the void is something that baffles us and mystifies us. God the enemy is something we fear. But God the companion, Whitehead says, is something you imitate. It's someone you try to reflect. And I love this language of companion for thinking about the God-world relationship, because a companion is somebody who walks with you. It's somebody who is beside you, who understands you. And Whitehead has various statements of using this companion language. For example, God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. And the wonderful thing about the language of companionship is that to have a companion is to be a companion, right? Companionship assumes this sense of mutual loyalty, of mutual immanence, if you want to use that language. So for Whitehead, then, the other side of your loyalty, your religious loyalty to the world, in part is God's religious loyalty to you as world. It's a beautiful sense of divine world loyalty. And so we'll conclude then with Griffin's statement. Religion as world loyalty indicates that it's no individualistic relation between the soul and God. Rather, the universe disclosed in religious experience is through and through interdependent. Truly, to worship God involves imitating God as much as possible, working for the good of the whole world. That is what Whitehead means by defining religion at its best as world loyalty. Well, it's a wonderful statement. I remember when I first saw the statement of religion being world loyalty, I was attracted to it immediately and wanting to think through what that means and what that means for also an image of God, what it means theologically. So before I conclude, let me briefly just revisit where we have been today. We've seen 10 transitions, okay, from exception to exemplification, from being to becoming, from mechanism to organism, from independence to mutual immanence, from force to persuasion, from dogmatism to dynamism, from passivity to creativity, from decadence to adventure, from pessimism to possibility, and finally, from solitude to divine world loyalty. So I thank you all for your attention. I'd be really interested to hear what some of you think about these transitions, which are important, or how they, I mean, all important, but which resonate with you the most, either existentially or theologically, since I tried to make those distinctions, and also perhaps how these resonate in ways that overlap or are distinct from some of the 14 transformations there at the Cobb Institute. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen here.